Yesterday and even today, I had the chance to talk to different journalists, or seeing now, being part of the Global Media Forum, and I was interested to know, what do you think about what's happening? One common thing that I heard is most of you have one concern: how polarized the coverage on the conflict is, especially after the 7th of October, the terror attack on the 7th of October, which is the deadliest day for Jews after the Holocaust. And also the ensuing war in Gaza, which experts say, quote, it is and it sits among the most deadliest and most destructive war in recent history. All this is leading to that more voices are accusing and calling the Israeli military operation in Gaza a genocide. A charge Israeli officials in turn say it's both false, anti-Semitic, and false. Among all this, we as journalists are in the middle of it, trying every day to report, to be accurate, and trying every day to not be biased. Why? Because there are different accusations towards journalists, towards international media organizations, telling them you're pro-Israeli. Others say, no, you're pro-Palestinian. And this is every day, and this is also discussion among all of you happening, who is when, on which side. And that's why today I would like to know from my panelists, what are the right words to describe what is happening, and how can we, and every one of you here coming from all over the world, do his or her or their job and be responsible, journalistic, and ethically right to represent the pain and what is happening on the ground. This is what we'll be discussing today. Let's look at the video.
It is one thing for us to have a story to tell. Another thing is how it is being told.
But how can you talk about a conflict that apparently divides the world into two camps? The October 7 terror attack by Hamas on Israel and the subsequent war in Gaza has polarized the world. Journalists covering the Israel-Hamas war are confronted with a completely new dimension of violence, misinformation, and propaganda. To what extent are we able to portray the suffering on both sides? And how do we ensure that differing voices are heard? How can we discuss and report on Israel and the Palestinian territories without bias? The struggle for objectivity, compassion, and the right words on the Middle East conflict.
How do we assure that different voices are heard? That's what we're doing today. We're going to listen to different voices, and very happy to welcome my panelists to answer these questions and to understand more from their perspective how they are reporting that. So with a big warm applause, I would like to welcome international correspondent for CNN. She has covered the aftermath of the 7th of October. Welcome, Nada Bashir from London. Please join us. I'm happy to welcome an Indian broadcast journalist and founder editor of Mojo Story, a multimedia digital platform. Barkadat, welcome. I'm also very happy to welcome the Middle East analyst at Deutsche Welle. She worked for Israeli media outlets and publications like Channel 10 and Haaretz. Shani Rosanes, welcome. A philosopher and director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. She has previously taught philosophy at the Yale University and Tel Aviv University. Susan Neiman, welcome. And we want to hear different voices, and that's why we're happy to be joined by a Palestinian journalist joining us from Cairo. We're supposed to see him now. He's a journalist, and you can hear us. He's a journalist and was until recently based in Gaza Strip. A month into the October 7th war, he managed to evacuate. We'll listen today to his experience. He works for different international media outlets. He works also for Deutsche Welle and also for Washington Post. But he told me today he's representing himself. Welcome, Hazem Balusha. So welcome, everybody. And the good news is you can prepare your questions, because you have the possibility later to answer, to ask, and we'll try to answer also your questions. So, and if not, I will approach you. So everyone be awake till the end of this session. I will just come to every one of you. We just saw in the video, we at Deutsche Welle call what happened on the 7th of October a terror attack. Nada, at CNN, what do you call what happened on the 7th of October?
Well, it's not for us to pass a judgment on what actually happened, but to address how the world views it, how Israel views it. Israel, of course, considers this to have been a terrorist attack, as do many other members of the international community, and that is exactly how we would report that. This is an organization, Hamas, that is considered by many in the international community to be a terrorist organization. But of course, we can't take out the context from that either. For many in the Palestinian community, be that in Gaza or in the occupied West Bank, Hamas is considered to be a resistance movement as well. And we have to look at what happened before October 7th, because the idea that this sort of came out of nowhere isn't really the case. For many who have been following what's been happening in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, there have been bubbling tensions for some time now before October 7th. And so there was this anticipation that there could be some sort of violence taking place, perhaps an uprising. There were many discussions around whether we'd see a violent uprising or an intifada in the occupied West Bank, for example. So it's really important to consider the context when we're talking about how different perspectives are sort of taken into account in this conflict. Of course, that doesn't in any way justify what we saw on October 7th. It was a horrific attack, and it is considered by the Israeli government and by many other allies as a terrorist attack, and we have to address that.
But at the beginning, from the beginning, you decided as an editorial line to say it's an attack and to give the context, but not call it precisely terror attack.
I mean,
or did it change within and evolve within the?
There's certainly been evolving languages that we've used within CNN, but of course, it really just depends on the context in which we're talking about it. It's never for us to say this is a terrorist attack. We have said, the Israeli government considers this to be a terrorist attack.
Okay. Shane, when I look into Deutsche Welle, we use very clear the term terror attack. Why?
Well, the technical simple explanation is that Deutsche Welle reaches out or looks into two major resources of other distinguished journalistic endeavors. This is the DPA, the German press agency, and AP, when we look for guidelines on how to deal with issues. And here we've saw very different approaches taken by these two, but I think it was I wasn't part of that decision at the early days, but I think the decision was to make that stand for what it is. I also think it's important to bring into this context the fact that Deutsche Welle is a German institution. And whenever we never work in a vacuum. As journalists, we always want to see ourselves independent and free thinkers, and we should and we must be. But at the same time, there's a very clear context of culture that we're operating in. It doesn't matter if it's in London or in Delhi or in Berlin, broadcasting to the world. And the decision to name it as such, I think, was also rooted in that. In the sense that there was the German press agency, who was also a good Hinweis, a good way to follow. And eventually you got to make a decision, and that's an editorial decision that had to be made.
Mm-hmm. We've been heard, some call it attack, others call it terror attack. In some Arabic-speaking media, the attack is called the events of the 7th of October, and Hamas is classified by the EU and the US as a terror organization, is called the resistant Hazm. So what happens is I'm sitting in the region, in the Middle East region. I go to a certain Arabic-speaking media. They call it resistance. They call it the events. And then I just scroll down or I change the channel, and then it's called the terror attack. How do you think is that affecting on the perception and the judgment of the people in the region looking at what happened at the 7th of October?
I think this is a very important and fair question, actually, but it's up to the media outlet. It's not about journalists who would classify or categorize this action or that, no matter what. I mean, like whether about October 7 or something else. But here we know, and everybody knows that when they watch, they know how this outlet addressing things. But I mean, as journalists, individuals, it's not our rule to categorize an action. We can tell the facts, and the people and the audience who would decide this is right or wrong, this is the things that we should describe it this way or not. So we are quoting people saying, as you said in your introduction, you call it terror attack, and when you said the most destructive war in the recent history, you put it in quotes.
Yeah, but the thing is, what is the reaction of the people on the ground when they talk to you, when you listen to them? What do they tell you? Because there is a discussion about how different media outlets are covering what's happening.
Well, the people are different. I mean, those people who believe that in that action, in favor of what happened on October 7, they would defend it, and they listen and watch or read the media outlets that they are in favor of that, which is very obvious. And for those who are agonists, they would criticize the other outlets that they are in favor of, and they go for different media outlets. It's so obvious when I talk to people in Gaza or outside, Palestinians who fled from Gaza, they go to the outlet that they meet their opinions more than anything. They watch what others say in a way to criticize more than listening.
Mm-hmm. What we've also been hearing after the October 7th is, when I personally talked to some Palestinians, is they criticized the media for not talking enough about what was happening to the Palestinian before what they say the 7th of October. Would you underline that the media now is putting it as it happened the 7th of October, not before, the context?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The international media has found it far too easy to ignore the occupation and to ignore what was happening both in Gaza and on the West Bank. And in that sense, I suppose, but in that sense only, I can understand the temptation of some people to call it an act of resistance. However, I'm experiencing a lot of cognitive dissonance at the moment, because we just saw a 10-minute performance, a very powerful performance, of what it is like, particularly for women, to live in an Islamist society. And those who are referring to Hamas, I mean, one has even, things that look as if they could be jokes, queers for Hamas, et cetera, those who are considering Hamas to be, in some sense, a liberatory organization are, I fear, dividing the world into tribalist categories that we really, that do not help us in the least. It is not, one need not praise the Israeli government, the bombing of Gaza, or the occupation for the last 53 years in order to call what happened on October 7th a massacre. It was a massacre. It was a war crime. Anytime you, murder, 1,200 women and children and men in gruesome and bloody ways, it's a massacre. I don't see why we can't both acknowledge that and say that the Israeli government's response, which Hamas had, of course, entirely calculated, is equally a war crime. Those are not incompatible things to say.
You mentioned war crime, which is a legal term. So when do you think journalists should use legal terms where till now there's no court that decided that it's a war crime? I would like to ask for back,
okay.
But I'll get back to you.
I come from a country that has always recognized the right of the Palestinian people to their own state, what's called a two-state solution. And yet India and the Indian media characterized what happened on the 7th of October as a terror attack. I agree with that nomenclature. I agree with what Susan just said. I think the polarization is unnecessary and self-inflicted by the media, coming from a place of a kind of either-or ideological bias on either side of the trenches that is not necessary. And let me just say, I did have the opportunity to report from Israel in the immediate aftermath of the attacks of October 7th. It's unfortunate I couldn't go to Gaza because at that time nobody could enter Gaza.
Still till now, it's
And
not
to
allowed.
see the kibbutz and the sort of remains of, what had been done to little children and women, oftentimes civilians who had advocated for peace with the Palestinian people. This is very important to remember. And at that time, coming from a country that has often, in an isolated way, been at the receiving end of terrorism with the world barely noticing, I think the Indian response and the response of the Indian media was one way. But just to add one sentence, I know I'm taking up more time. As the conflict went along, as we saw how Netanyahu responded, as we saw people out in the streets in Israel against Netanyahu, as we saw what was happening to women and children in Gaza, the moral compass shifted. The moral compass does
So
shift.
what would you call what's happening now in Gaza?
A massacre of civilians.
Based on what?
Israel had the right to retaliate to Hamas. That retaliation did not include the right to punish those who are powerless against the Hamas.
Chani, we have one perception of what's happening. How are the Israeli media covering, when we talk now, what's happening in Gaza?
It's simply put, they don't cover Gaza.
They don't.
Unfortunately, many of my dear colleagues in Israel I find to be betraying their role in bringing what's happening in Gaza to the Israeli public. But we need to remember one thing when you talk about Israelis and where they are. We are now 8 months after this started, and Israelis are still stuck in October. They are very much there. October 7th is still very much alive. The leading Israeli news broadcaster yesterday had a 20 minutes magazine story about many of the examples of what happened in Be'eri, one of the small kibbutzim next to Gaza. The Israelis are still reliving that trauma again and again and again. Not to mention, many are still displaced from their homes. There's still what's happening in the northern border and so on. There's still also controversy brewing within the Israeli society. But the Israeli media finds itself still drawn to that, partially because personal stories are easier to tell and are easier, to grasp people's attention with. Partially because when it comes to ideology, political issues that are on the table, the discourse in Israel has become so polarized that it's really hard to deal with it without being marked as a traitor or a leftist. But Israelis are still living October 7th. And in that essence, I mean, when we keep that in mind, it also helps us understand why it's so hard to maybe things that would look rationally more probable to happen when it comes to political or any other processes, when it comes to constructive building of the future of what's happening in Gaza and for Israelis. This is why Israelis are not really there yet. They're not ripe for that discussion because they're still in the emotional phase of dealing with that.
But
They don't have monopoly over pain and trauma and struggle. We're seeing terrible things in Gaza. But I'm telling you where Israelis are for themselves now.
The population and the people, why do you think the media is not covering what's happening in Gaza?
Well,
Because that has an effect on what's going on.
Well, first of all, I don't think in the recent years Israelis have been not too tuned up to Palestinian voices onto what's happening in the Palestinian side, period. And I think after October 7th especially, this became a bigger challenge to be able to tune into other people's suffering or narratives when you are so still very much hurting and consumed by your own. But then it also at the same time, there's the technical limitations of access there that can only be done through the Israeli IDF spokesperson unit.
But there's the UN giving a lot of reports. Would we see the UN reports also being in the Israeli media?
Sorry.
The UN report, the human rights organizations, UN, WFP.
Again, Israelis are very much feeling the world is against them. They feel that this moment, October 7th was such a turning point and such a moment of deep crisis, because I think for many Israelis, even those who pursue peace, they've always felt the discussion was around 1967. That is, the discussion was on whether Israeli borders, as you know, with the settlements, the occupation, so are these legitimate or not? Can we find a solution to make it happen? And following October 7th, there's a reckoning by many Israelis, or so it seems, that the discussion is about 1948. It's about the very existence of the state of Israel. Should it or shouldn't be, you know, for Israelis, of course, it's not a question, but they feel the world is posing that question and the very legitimacy of the state of Israel. And this brings everybody to unite together because they feel the world is against them. And Israelis are still very much in this place of us against the world. And in many ways, all the international pressure actually feeds into that because it justifies that stand of nobody sees us and understands us.
When you mentioned that some are still at the 7th of October, if we talk to Palestinians, Hazem, then they would say, why no one is mentioning what happened before that? You were in Gaza, you had to evacuate. When you were in Gaza, how was the response? How were the people talking about what happened? And also, were you able to work freely in Gaza and report on what's going on?
Yeah, I was in Gaza. I was at home. It was like early morning when it happened. I spent like about almost a month in Gaza till Rafah was open, and I fled with my family. It was horrible. I got displaced 5 times myself. My house at the time in the day one, the windows were smashed as well. It was frightening when the Israeli response started. Yes, I mean, I can say I know Gaza. I'm experienced journalist. I'm working in the field in more than 20 years. So I can't say I am in a free country. It's a free speech, but I was free to cover what's happening. I mean, from the Palestinian side, that we cover things. Even when I left, you know, I still approach people and we talk freely. Some people are open and speak freely. Some people are very cautious and very careful when they speak, and not only because of Hamas, but also because of the Israeli action. So people are divided, and as well, like in Gaza, there was polarization. People in the beginning, they didn't understand what's happening. They thought that was, as the Israelis are hating Palestinians, still Palestinians are believe that, and they hate the Israelis, and many people were celebrating what happened, and that was very obvious in the videos. But it's still, many people were shocked and they didn't expect. Now it's very obvious if you see and look at the landscape of reaction from Gaza. There is a huge criticism against Hamas, but I mean, in the same time, they are not justifying what Israeli army is doing in Gaza. But I mean, in social media, people very brave, critical on and reach to insulting some Hamas figures. But in the same time, there are still some people in favor of what Hamas is doing, and they ask them to keep fighting against the troops in Gaza.
One of the discussions that's also happening the last months, it's the debate about the genocide or not a genocide. We see some media outlets deciding and writing genocide in Gaza. Although genocide is a legal term and needs years to be verified and to be checked. Nada, how did you report on that?
Well, like you said, genocide is a legal term with legal implications. By declaring that something is a genocide, that naturally draws some sort of legal response as well. So it's not for media outlets, for journalists to determine whether or not what we're seeing in Gaza is a genocide. We certainly at CNN don't term it as a genocide because we are, of course, reporting on what's happening at the ICJ, for example, the International Court of Justice, where there are hearings ongoing around whether or not this is a genocide. We can, of course, discuss what we're seeing on the ground and how that might lead world leaders, lead international figures, including the United Nations, to consider whether this is a genocide. When we're talking about the killing of civilians, when we're talking about the destruction of schools and UN buildings, when we're talking about the famine in parts of northern Gaza now. These are all signposts towards what could be considered a genocide. And in fact, as early as November, we heard warnings from the United Nations saying that this has all the hallmarks, all the makings of a potential genocide. And we've seen that continue to unfold and deepen since that point. So of course, there are naturally considerations around whether or not we should be calling this a genocide as media outlets. There are some, as you mentioned, that have already gone ahead and said that. But again, it is a legal term. It does have legal implications, the same way we don't declare a famine on our own as well. These are all things that, you know, we have international bodies that handle that.
If you want to comment on that, I can see it and feel it.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with Nada, also with the internationally, I think, most distinguished historian of genocide, Omar Batov, who says it has all the marks of things on the way to genocide. And, you know, why argue about that? But there are two terms, or actually four, that I think are far more important than words like genocide or not genocide or almost genocide. And they're used so often that I almost doubt I will be able to get anyone in this room to stop using them. But that's actually why I came here, because I have told many journalists in separate interviews and many friends, would you stop talking about pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli positions? This is not a football match. Thank you, and now I hope that all of you will not succumb to the temptation that everybody who I've said this to succumbs to. Yes, you're right, Susan, it's not a matter of team sports, it's a matter of human rights, but it's simpler. Everybody knows what you're talking about, and every time you use that terminology, you are simplifying what is a complicated concept. Okay. And the one thing we could really do to change the discourse would be to come up with some a little more complicated, but genuinely meaningful terms.
Okay.
Just quickly, also, one reason to stop using it, it's not mutually exclusive. You can be both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian and understand that the solution lies right there.
Yes,
and understanding that the solution for this bloody conflict would come only from wanting to promote both societies and understanding they need to find a joint solution together. There's no other way.
Arka?
I agree with everything I've heard so far. I just want to add a line. Yes, let's not be reductionist. Let's not be converting grief into a competitive sport. I think that's very important. But B, to criticize Hamas is not to criticize the Palestinian people or to not recognize their rights or their suffering. And to criticize Netanyahu or the way Israel has chosen to respond to the very egregious terror attacks of October 7th is not to deny the historicity of how Israel was created. So let us not conflate Israel with this war response of the Israeli people, and let us not conflate the Palestinian people with Hamas. That is such reductionist language.
Okay. Then I would go to one of the facts that happened according to our study, just to get some facts into our discussion. In January, The Intercept published an analysis of New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times coverage of the war for, October 7th through 24th of November. The Intercept analysis showed that the major newspapers reserved terms like slaughter, massacre, and horrific almost exclusively for Israeli civilians killed by Palestinians rather than for Palestinian civilians killed in an Israeli attack. So the analysis found also that as of November 24, the New York Times had described Israeli deaths as a massacre on 53 occasions, and those of Palestinians just once. The ratio that they say for the use of slaughter was 22-1, even as the documented number of Palestinians killed climbed around 15,000 at that time. So how would you explain this?
But that time, what was the time for the research? What do we know about
Between the 7th of October and the 24th of November. where the death toll, according what they say, was already at 15,000. So is this biasm? What is this? What would you call it?
Oh, I would call it clear bias, and it's very hard for me to defend Joe Biden, particularly at this moment. But interestingly enough, he said exactly the right thing when he went to Tel Aviv just after the massacre. He said, I understand your rage, I understand your pain, but do not make the mistake that we made after 9/11. And that was actually a historic speech, okay? Because American presidents do not criticize American foreign policy when they're standing on foreign soil. And had the rest of the world listened to him, that is, you know, I mean, you can put it down to two wrongs don't make a right. We would all be in much better shape. The problem is that it's not just the case that, let's say, the more Western or Northern or however we want to chop people up have been, not unremittingly, but have been very loath. Many have been loath to describe what's going on in Gaza, but we have it exactly the other way around from the other side. And you know, if we can remember the conflicts that we had in September 2001 and look back at them now and draw some lessons from that, we would all be better off.
Okay. But why do you think such things are happening in international media outlets? Where does it come from?
I think in particular, the first days after the attack, the first weeks after the attack, I think the shock was tremendous. I think it was far beyond Israel and the region. I think also among, I know for a fact, among many Arabs and Palestinians, this shock was very big. I think things have shifted since. This is why I asked you. I think the coverage and the focus on the atrocities that are happening in Gaza has kind of shifted, rightfully so. I mean, Gaza and the Palestinians deserve our attention. But I think at that particular moment, these figures, I think, reflect on that, that very deep shock of the beginning.
And then I'll add also one to it at CNN. According to Jerusalem Post, CNN staff, including well-renowned Christiane Amanpour, criticized the network's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war, accusing the network of holding an Israeli bias. There was an internal discussion happening in CNN. What was the output after that?
Well, look, throughout this conflict, there have been internal discussions. It's an evolutionary process. You know, I think there's a tendency amongst media outlets to rely on the same style guides and rule books that we were sort of relying on in the early 2000s without any sort of attention to the fact that this conflict has very much evolved and we need to evolve with that. And so there have been very open discussions within our network and with other networks, I'm sure, about the language that we're using, the way that we cover it, the context that we're providing, the attention that we're giving to certain stories.
Is it helping? We had a discussion also with different journalists. Is it helping that international media outlets are getting more diverse, are having more different perspectives within the editorial room? Is that changing?
Absolutely. I think it plays a huge, huge part, and I see that in our own newsroom. The fact that we do have such a diverse newsroom, particularly on the international side of things, where you can bring in those different perspectives. You can bring in, importantly, the lived experience of what it means to live in a country that is at war, to be an Arab or a Palestinian living under an occupation in the occupied West Bank and parts of the occupied West Bank. I mean, that is a crucial part of enriching our coverage and our reporting, and without that, we don't have that insight.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say that this is not just a debate about foreign policy or statecraft, it's also a debate about us as journalists and what our obligations are. And while there's a tendency in a hyper-partisan world for us to be tribal rather than honest, our obligations are exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. We are not meant to make the truth or distill the truth into camps of left and right, pro this and anti this. We are meant to explain complexity to our audience.
But then how do you explain the whole
By,
polarization
in
and
this
discussion?
conversation, we are trying to tell you that it is possible to hold more than one thought at the same time. But you are pushing us to choose this word or that word, this word or that word. That is not the truth of what is happening.
Because I'm
This
trying
is
to
a
reflect the
complex-
reality when you talk to people. This is
And
the
both
conversation
things are
going on social
possibly-
media. This is what's happening.
And I would say, and I think many in this room would agree, that what happened on 7th October was horrific and does not need any ifs and buts. And what has happened since is also horrific. And if you're going to ask me to amplify one side and not amplify the other, whichever way, I am failing in my job as a journalist.
Mm-hmm. So the headline of Global Media Forum is sharing solutions.
Yes.
I would like to just add one thing. I think we're many times oblivious or not put enough attention on the technical restrictions that guide our work in the sense of our access to Gaza, for example, our access to Hamas leaders, you know. There are many publications and media outlets that have a clear policy of not even having any Hamas speaker on air. Because there's always this dilemma of, do you give a voice, and by that, do you amplify those messages and you give legitimacy to that? Or on the other side, by not maybe giving this platform, you're letting them, you know, just get away with their own propaganda and messaging without needing to be confronted by the hard questions. And I think this is also something we need to keep into this discourse. You know, there's very different, you know, there's this embedded imbalance in our technical ability to cover and discuss the sides involved in this conflict. And I think the state of Israel, as the modern state, democratic state it wants to be, deserves a criticism as we would give to any other modern democratic or country. But then at the same time, we need to remember this imbalance that is built into the very discourse that we're all part of.
Nowadays, the Israeli officials are not allowing independent journalists to enter to Gaza to report, and that's what we hear. So a lot of outlets say, we don't know what's happening, we don't have people on the ground. You could be embedded, but they have then the control according what we hear. How is that affecting on representing the concerns of the Palestinians on the ground?
I think the notion that we don't have a clear idea of what's happening on the ground because we're not there is completely false.
But there are...
We hear it a lot. We do hear it a lot from a whole range of outlets, including Western media outlets. But the fact is, there are countless Palestinian journalists on the ground documenting each and every minute of what is happening, and we have relied so heavily on their testimonies, on their reporting, on their videos, on their footage to paint a picture of what is happening on the ground. And of course, there is access in these embeds that we see with the Israeli military that are happening less and less now, but again, heavily restricted. You're seeing exactly what the Israeli military wants you to see, and the option to push back is very, very limited. And although, you know, we have seen many embeds, CNN has taken part in those embeds, we have had the opportunity very briefly to get access to Gaza with an aid organization away from the Israeli military. But what has been sort of what has really underpinned our coverage throughout this process, throughout the war, is the work of Palestinian journalists on the ground in Gaza, reporting, filming, writing, keeping us updated with what is happening. And of course, we have to remember that they are doing this every single day, risking their own lives, many of them who have lost family members, their own children, who are living through an unfolding famine. I mean, these are not conditions that anyone should live through, but imagine that they are working through this day in, day out to bear witness to what is happening. So I think the idea that, you know, our sort of awareness or knowledge of what is happening in Gaza is somewhat diminished because we're not there is a little bit false. But what I think is the reality, unfortunately, is that world leaders don't necessarily pay attention as much to what the Palestinian journalists are saying, and that's not new. That's been the case for decades now. We've had Palestinian journalists in the occupied West Bank, in Gaza, reporting on what is happening, their own lived experience, and yet we don't give that the same level of attention that we do with mainstream media outlets and Western journalists who fly in. And that's not a new problem.
And it was one of the, it's very deadliest for the journalists. 108 journalists so far
has
been
the
killed.
deadliest conflict for media workers, and these are the vast majority Palestinian journalists on the ground in Gaza. So, you know, despite that, they are still working. We still see them working every single day, and their work is incredible, and it's something that we really have to pay attention to and learn from.
We can talk to Hazem, who was doing that for one. Hazem, you were there. You were doing that. What are the circumstances the journalists are working now in Gaza?
It's horrible. It's unbearable, to be honest.
Can you give me a concrete example? What does that mean?
Yeah, of course. I mean, yourself. There is always a debate between you have to care, to take care of yourself, your family, your beloved people, or you focus on work. Many journalists, they don't meet their families. They are separated. Many of them, they live themselves in tents. They suffer from a lack of food, lack of water. So when I was there myself, I was like occupied of many things that to do personally, to find food, to find water, drinking water. And I, imagine that for 2 weeks, I barely had a shower, or if you're gonna call it a shower. The first thing that I did when I left, I took a deep shower. But plus that they are under threat. We don't know when we were there what is the target. My outlet told the Israeli side about my place where I was based after my displacement. What the answer they did, they said that we can't guarantee his safety. So I could be affected by any if I was in a wrong place or a wrong time, I would be killed. And that what happened to many journalists. That's why there is a huge a deadly number of media workers who were killed in this war.
Mm-hmm. The voices are getting louder. I remember yesterday the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, while she was talking at the Global Media Forum, she was saying it's unacceptable what is happening now to the journalists in Gaza. Why are you? Maybe one.
Well, I would be pleased if the German politicians actually did something rather than getting off with a light, it's unacceptable. I am waiting for action. Maybe I should make
what
one...
What are you missing?
I'll tell you, well, I'm missing a lot.
Tell me,
but
examples.
Let me tell you something first, and then you can push me more if you like. So I am a universalist Jew. Many people have forgotten that there's a great universalist Jewish tradition. Includes people like Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and et cetera, et cetera. People tend to think that Jews are all nationalist and tribalist, which perhaps is the case in Germany and in much in the state of Israel. But it's very important to remember that's not the case. So for me, that a dead baby from my tribe is not a greater loss than a dead baby from a Palestinian tribe. But supposing, yeah, thanks for clapping, but honestly, I think this is sort of, this ought to be obvious, right? I mean, one child is one child, and this is not something that we need to argue about. But what puzzles me is, supposing you say that actually you think, as a German, Jewish lives are more important than Palestinian lives, and Jewish safety in Germany is more important than anything else. I can sort of get behind that. What both the government and the media would like to do, above all, is to protect the safety of Jews in Germany. I do not understand why people think the one-sided reporting of the conflict will do anything but reverberate and resound on Jews in Germany. That is, the kind of anti-Semitism measures that involve a very one-sided reporting of the conflict in Gaza is in the process of creating much more anti-Semitism than it prevents. And I don't understand why that's not easy for media and politicians in this country to see.
Mm-hmm. Shani, would you agree it's one-sided?
I'm not versed enough with how deep it goes. I do think that there's something, when it comes to talking about Jews in this discussion, I'm an Israeli, I'm also a Jewish Israeli, it's not always the same. I do think that the fear that October 7 stoked among Jews around the world is something that maybe sometimes media outlets fail to understand. And it also comes into this complexity you're talking about, the need to escape reductionism, and this is exactly it. How can you, if you're not, you don't even have to be a Zionist Jew in order to feel that reverberations of that effect of October on Jews and their feelings of safety around the world. So I do agree with you that being too biased, and I do feel that many times the crackdown on Palestinian protest and dissent and more than legitimate expressions of fear is exactly backfiring, because we have to let both narratives exist because they do exist. We have to let the pain of both sides be seen and acknowledged. There's no other way around it.
So I'm sorry, I live in Berlin and I've been following intensely, alas, the media coverage. What's going on and being covered in Germany is extraordinarily different from, I follow the American press, the British press and Haaretz, and you would think you were seeing a different conflict, okay?
Are you not, as a
one
journalist and listening also to different journalists, this accusation are happening, but didn't you see also that some are trying or working on that, or you say like it's ultimately one-sided based on an opinion?
I am amazed at the number of reports that have come out, front page, Spiegel, Zeit, everybody else. Jews in this country are afraid, okay? Which Jews? Many of us, less than half of us. Pardon?
I am.
Yeah, well, less than half of us are actually represented by the official Jewish community. And,
I agree with you. First of all, what you see here is a great example of...
The thing is, we still have only 2 minutes, and I promised the audience to be interactive, and I'm like...
classic things.
And you want to talk?
This is a classic demonstration of that, but I don't think we need to minimize the fear that Jews are experiencing in order to, again, all this feeling of this mutually exclusive pain of one over the other, this is not where the truth lies. I mean...
I agree with you. I'm just saying that the German reporting is quite one-sided and does not reflect the experience of many Jews who live here.
Allow me. Okay. Barcha,
Yeah.
you mentioned solutions, and as a moderator at the end I have to say, what are the solutions? And you have 1 minute, and also want to talk to the audience.
Well, somebody figured out the Middle East conflict. Let's hear it.
I'm like, what hasn't been done for decades and centuries, I'm going to do now in my last 30 seconds. No, I'm not going to be reductionist. However, I do want to say, just like there's no hierarchy to suffering, and that's the obvious point that Susan made, that a dead baby is a dead baby. Let there be no hierarchy to conflicts. I do want to say, as somebody who comes from a different part of the world with no direct skin in the game, there are conflicts in my backyard in Afghanistan. There is the forgotten conflict of, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Russia, Ukraine. Nobody even mentions it anymore. We also have to ask why we, as media, turn our attention on some stories and not on the others. What about women in Afghanistan? When are we going to talk about that? It's next door to India. I feel it almost like I know that better in a more tactile way than I know this, though I've reported this story. All I'm saying is the lesson for us, sharing solutions, we are not here to adjudicate on human suffering. A job of a journalist is to give voice to the voiceless. You tell the stories of those who suffer without taking sides.
Okay. I'll allow myself 2 questions if the organizers say okay, because we are out of time. Is that okay? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Elsie Mufarrij. I'm coming from Lebanon, from the Alternative Press Syndicate in Lebanon. We in Lebanon, we lost 3 journalists, journalists, and in Palestine, more than 150 journalists. one of our dear journalists, Isama Abdullah, we have more than 9 reports and investigation about that Israel killed him on, I'm saying investigation on the international level, not from the Lebanese level. And still there is impunity on this case. You're asking about solution. I think that we will not have solution as long as we don't see what happened before 7 October. When we see that the atrocity just started on 7 October. We will not have solution as long as any foreign or Arab journalist working in foreign media will be attacked as anti-Semist, knowing that we in the region of the MENA region, we are Semist people, okay, we are all Semist people, not just the descendants of the Jewish are Semist people. So as long as they are attacked as anti-Semist, as if they criticize the Israeli politics, and anything else will be considered as in freedom of press or freedom of expression. We will not
question
have,
or
yes,
just
yes.
because of time, you know?
I just want to finish.
Because we're already -2.
Yes, okay, and we'll not have solution as long as we'll not see that dehumanizing the Palestinian people and thinking about words when telling it's a genocide or no, but we see, for instance, in the Russia war, we can clearly call it that it's an occupation, atrocity, war crime.
Okay.
So we have this double standard. As long as we have the double standard, we will not have solution. Thank you.
Thank you for your input and the perspective that's been shared among journalists, but the challenge is when you compare different wars happening, different situations, different contexts, part of it. Some agree on that, others disagree on that, but I have to say there are different opinions on that to be inclusive for everyone. Yes, please. You could open the microphone where you're sitting, or you can. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Alla Gavrilov. I'm a war correspondent from Israel. So basically my question is why no one is here on this panel is from Israel and has been to, yes, but as I understand, you're not living there. And what you have said, the context that you, Shani, had given is completely inaccurate. One, we do cover war. I've been 3 times in Gaza for the last 6 months.
Have you ever shown Palestinian suffering?
Yes.
Are you showing on Israeli TV
yes,
Palestinian
I'm not
suffering?
on TV, sorry. But,
Okay.
but no, you're wrong.
Oh, well, you're an exceptional then. Well, the rule is such, you open channel 2, you open channel 13, you won't find it.
And the second thing that basically, second thing that no one was talking here about the hostages. So this question, when we talk only about October 7th and only about the war right now, which by the way call conflict, and it's not right. Conflict, it's when you argue with the neighborhood about parking space. This is war. People are dying on both sides. By the way, not only Jews, Israeli Arabs, 27 Israeli Bedouins were killed on 7th of October. And people continue to die.
And they're still hostages.
Thank you for your...
Again, the question was why no one in this panel is actually have been to Israel, have been to war.
Shani,
sorry, I don't appreciate you putting judgment on how Israeli I am. I don't think it's appropriate. And I think we can agree to disagree, and we do disagree, but I am also not a spokesperson for the Israeli IDF or the Israeli government. I am an independent journalist, and I give my observation of things. I will not be letting you doubt my Israeliness or my connection to my homeland.
I'm not doubting it. I'm just saying that you haven't been to the war and you haven't seen it.
We listened to your input. Thank you. It's part of the discussion happening.
May I say that as it happens, I'm also an Israeli citizen, although I have not been there since October 7th. But we were given 45 minutes, 5 panelists I don't know how in the world we're supposed to cover everything.
But you did it. A warm applause for all my panelists. You did it. I can imagine that we still need more time. Nevertheless, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. And I'm over 5 minutes. If I had been now on TV, then I would be fired. I'm happy I'm still working now. Thank you, everyone. Keep the discussion, and thank you for sharing your perspectives. Thank you.